Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Red Lines, a show where we dive into daring subjects and cross red lines of political speak. Today, Jonathan Fink of Silicon Curtain and I are going to discuss what is going on with the world. Because clearly, for the first time since World War II, the world order is changing. So, what's it going to look like in the nearest future? And it's going. Let's start with you introducing yourself, and then we can just straight talk.
So I'm Jonathan Fink. I'm host of Silicon Curtain podcast. It's one of the largest pro-Ukrainian podcasts globally, still growing. And we're part of, I would say, a digital community fighting Russian disinformation. And this community is collaborating more and more. So it's great to see this. It's taken a while, but here we are, year 3 of the war, and there's a lot more collaboration going on.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot more kind of like going. You know how friends meet in each other's places. I feel like the Ukrainian community meets on each other's channels, and it's really nice to see that. So yeah, well, today I sort of thought that we would discuss this kind of interesting situation that Ukraine has found itself in, seeing as we are very dependent on the United States. And we're very anti-imperial. However, in the last week or so, Donald Trump has made a lot of very, very interesting statements. Some of them include making Canada a state in the United States. And had he just said that once, it would not be nearly as disturbing as him repeating that almost daily. It would also not be nearly as disturbing if he wasn't also saying that Greenland does not belong to Denmark, and that he needs to look into treaties from way back when to make sure that Denmark actually owns Greenland, because he wants to buy Greenland. And then there is also that whole Gulf of Mexico situation. So I find this to be like a very interestingly impossible situation for Ukraine, because obviously we are fighting imperialism. This is an incredibly imperialistic outburst. But we are treading on such thin ice here, provided that we had just sort of found mutual language with Donald Trump, I suppose. So do you have comments on this subject? I'm sure you do, but I'm very curious to hear your opinion.
I mean, I don't want to recall necessarily Russian literature, and especially not somebody who was a nationalist. But I think, Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called, I think it was August 1914, because that was a pivotal moment in history. That's where an entire epoch became unhinged. And once that war had kicked off, at the end of it, we saw the Bolshevik Revolution. We saw monarchy, the idea of monarchy in Europe fall. I think February 2014 will come to be seen as a similar pivotal date, because that was at the point that the old world order was ripped up. That was at the point at which sovereign borders were challenged, and that violation of that very core principle of the world order really it went unanswered, and it's still unanswered. There's still no appetite to give Ukraine what it needs to take back its sovereign borders, including Crimea. Unfortunately, I think Trump admires autocrats. I think he's not an intellectual, an academic, but he looks at what they do, he looks at what they say. And I think he does pay attention, when he's not on the golf course, he does pay attention to what works. And he can see that these challenges and violations of sovereign borders have gone unanswered. Okay, it works. Great. Unfortunately.
Yeah, especially in this time and age, but it's very interesting, because obviously with Russia's history of sort of doing this and doing this so in such an unhinged manner where no one answers, is very different than like the president of the United States declaring that he wants to make Canada a state and Greenland a state, right? It's kind of like a very new. It's an interesting situation, because on the one hand, obviously, Putin wants a new world order. He wants a new world order where billionaires rule everything, and he's one of those billionaires, and where there is sort of no punishment for imperial ambitions. Anyways, so what I was trying to say is that we find ourselves in this like weird situation, right, where like Putin not technically, but very realistically is one of those billionaires. He's one of those Elon Musks, and he's one of those Peter Thiels, and he's one of those people that are trying to sort of influence elections and are trying to become parts of governments, and that are trying to impose sort of like this unpunishability on themselves. And it's weird to be in this specifically for Ukraine because we are fighting that, but we also depend on that. Like the United States 2 months ago is not the same United States that it's going to be on January 20th. I mean, of course, like the precursors were there, right? But on a government level, it's not the same thing. And interestingly, the US is technically giving Ukraine money to fight this tyrannical state that wants a new world order of billionaires and oligarchs ruling everything. But then we also have a millionaire oligarch in charge of the United States who seems to be very fond of what the rest of these billionaire, millionaire oligarchs are doing. And it's such an interesting kind of, it's not even a dichotomy. It's just like, I'm sorry, mindfuck. And I think there is no better way to say it.
And there's other trends along with it. Of course, we pay attention to the oligarchs and so on, or at least we pay attention to the mouthy oligarchs, such as Elon Musk. But there are many other oligarchs behind it. And then there are those who may be inclined to be more traditional conservatives and so on. Someone like Mark Zuckerberg, someone like Jeff Bezos. But what we're seeing is eerily reminiscent of Russia in the early 2000s, from my point of view. And that is that the other oligarchs, the tech oligarchs, are obeying in advance. They're doing what Timothy Schneider warned about and what he said was going to happen. They are, first of all, in Russia it happened that Putin got the oligarchs, once he tamed them, to buy up media holdings and then to silence satirical programs, to silence news reports that were going to be critical. And that was a takeover process that took many years. It's slightly different in the US because you've had these tech oligarchs already investing in and buying in media holdings, including Washington Post and many others. Now, unfortunately, and they may have carried on being relatively responsible, managers of and owners of these businesses. But of course, they fear that Donald Trump is going to take those businesses away. They fear he's going to impose levies on their businesses. They fear he's going to steal their businesses in the same way that Putin, say, stole Khodorkovsky's business and stuck him in jail. So they're obeying in advance. They are shutting down satirists. They're going to be firing cartoonists. They're going to be giving editorial directives not to mock the orange, clown who's in charge. And it's scarily reminiscent of what happened in Russia. And say Kukly, you'll be aware of the Kukly satirical program. Putin loathed it. I mean, one more thing before I let you say, I don't understand the West. I don't, there's all this conversation about we should be supporting Russian opposition, blah, blah, blah. And I think you and I will say, okay, well, that's a little bit of, money down the drain. Also, maybe it's not our role to support those. If there's going to be a genuine opposition in Russia, it needs to be paid for and supported by Russian people. But we could be investing in satirical material. We could be injecting satirical material into TikTok, into the social media bloodstream, to degrade the idea that Putin's a statesman, to degrade the idea that he's a strategist, to degrade the idea that there's anything statesman-like about him. But we're not doing any of these things.
Also, you mentioned the self-censoring in advance, right? Mark Zuckerberg and Instagram and the removal of fact-checkers and introduction of community notes similar to X style is really a very big example of that, because there is zero reasoning for Mark Zuckerberg to do that. The only reasoning for him to do that is to obey and abide Donald Trump and help him spread his propaganda.
Yeah, this is it. And he wasn't being let into the court of Mar-a-Lago. What you're looking at is something that functions a little bit like a medieval court. If you're out, you're out. I mean, you're not just outside the gossip of the court circle, outside the influence of lawmaking. Mm-hmm. You're outside the possibilities of potentially keeping your business. So this is a very different functioning of US government, one that I suspect the US has never had before. And it is scarily reminiscent of the court of the Tsar King in the Kremlin.
Yeah, it is very scarily reminiscent. It's because also, Jeff Bezos and not endorsing a candidate with Washington Post for the first time in ever really in the history of American elections is because he knows if the Washington Post, which is a liberal publication, endorses a liberal candidate, Jeff Bezos is going to be the one eating the wrath of that if and when Donald Trump becomes president, which he did, right? So in advance, they're all kind of kissing his ass.
Yeah.
All of these billionaires are doing because they know he's a vengeful. They know he does things because of personal bitterness or personal motives. And it is very scary. It is very, very scary, because I'm also finding Ukraine in this position, right, where we fully understand what's going on. And clearly, this is what we're fighting against. And it's such a crazily terrible place to be in, because now we also have to talk to that and reason with that. So it's
extraordinary, isn't it? It suddenly puts Ukraine not as this obscure corner of Europe fighting for its survival, which we sort of sympathize with, etc. It puts Ukraine at the front line of understanding the mechanics of tyranny and resisting it in a way that Europe has not woken up to do, in a way that America is losing the fight against. Suddenly Ukraine is the bleeding edge of freedom, perhaps even the last hope of finding an antidote to this process that we find ourselves in as sliding towards autocracy.
Yeah, I mean, this time is really eerily similar to me. Well, obviously not reminiscent, because I wasn't born then, or not even, I don't think my parents were born at that point, but World War II, it's very similar to that, because, no one wanted to wake up to what was happening in World War II. And for 2 years, it was a localized conflict with no issues, until these conflicts started peaking up here and there and there and there. But at that point, the US didn't have the issue it has today. Sure, it had Reagan, right, who was not necessarily very, very good at dealing with the war, and didn't necessarily want to, right? But
Roosevelt, you mean? Roosevelt,
right? Roosevelt. Oh
yeah.
My gosh, that was a horrible mistake on American politics. But yes, Roosevelt, who didn't necessarily want to deal with the war, and didn't necessarily want to help, and kind of was acting the same way as Donald Trump in terms of like, well, let's just talk to the guy.
I think I'm not hugely familiar with it. I think he thought that this was going to happen, but he couldn't carry, say, Congress and the public with him. So there's a slow process of thinking, right, this is inevitable, this is going to happen. How do we get to that point? How do we take the people with us? That's very difficult. I think we're in a different space here, because apart from Zelensky, there are no Churchills on the scene.
And Roosevelt wasn't interested in becoming an oligarchical tyrant himself.
No, he wasn't. In fact, they'd gone through that battle. Again, it's not a history I'm hugely familiar with, but America had really come out of the fight with robber barons. It had come through its own battle with oligarchs and then mafia during the Prohibition era. And, despite the extraordinary chaos and violence, the idea of sort of principles and democracy had won through. In that instance, those oligarchs, many of them became philanthropists as a way of, being able to keep their ill-gotten gains. The difference here is, we don't see Musk being tamed. We don't see him becoming a philanthropist. If anything, he is, I would class, a techno-fascist. And there are some deeply worrying trends with the kind of relationships that he and many in Trump's circle are building with the extreme nationalist far right across Europe. And anyone, and this is the Kremlin playbook, anyone who'll sow chaos. I mean, Musk has recently sought, I would say, to encourage insurrection in the UK, and suggests that Nigel Farage isn't extreme enough. No, we need Tommy Robinson and Andrew Tate. Not to get your program sued, but these are people who have been through court processes for pretty heinous crimes. So this isn't good.
Well, he also endorsed Nigel Farage before that, and he also was saying that the UK needs a far-right leader, which is something like, if we think about it, this is a South African man who's trying to take over American politics, and successfully has done so by investing lots and lots of money. This is kind of, when people talk about corruption in Ukraine, I find it so funny, because whether you voted for Donald Trump, whether you like Donald Trump or not, whether you like Elon Musk, what is painfully obvious here is that Elon Musk has paid through his way into Trump's inner circle, and then Trump put him into the government in a position that was not elected and was created for him. That is corruption, because it is receiving something in exchange for money. It just isn't so evident as Elon Musk coming to Donald Trump and being like, hey, I would like to buy this position in the government for $100 million, right? No, he was sponsoring his campaigns. He was doing a lot of stuff in the background. He was investing in the informational and media warfare. And all of that obviously was done between the two of them, not like Elon Musk just doing it for himself because he likes Donald Trump. Like, it's an agreement. It's an agreement of sort. And now Elon Musk carries a government position, an unelected official in the US government, in a position that doesn't exist. Which, this is, the prime example of how dangerous and damaging this is, because now we are in a democracy where we're not choosing who heads our government. And that's a wild sort of it's a very Russian scenario. And it's interesting how much more difficult it's going to be to fight against the Russian, Iranian, Chinese, North Korean scenario with the United States following it,
This is it. I mean, I've got an episode coming out later this evening, if I can get a signal to upload it, where I examine this very thing. And there are a couple of scenarios here. You have to say, okay, and there's going to be some normalization going on. But you could say, look, Trump, a bit of a slip of the tongue there. Trump is not going to invade Greenland. He's not going to annex Canada. These are negotiating tactics to instill fear and confusion and to gain more than he would have done or got through traditional negotiation. So, okay, we might not like the tone or the approach, but we could say, okay, if it's a negotiating technique, it will not result in a hot war or the actual annexation, but it will weaken the concept of international rule of law, but it won't descend into absolute chaos. That's, I would say, the most optimistic possibility. The other possibility, of course, is that he's a Russian agent. Okay, and immediately people go, oh, blah, blah, you go for that immediately. It's all. The likelihood is he isn't a direct agent, but that he's heavily influenced by that way of thinking. The mode of thinking, and you can see why Russians fall into this. It's a deeply paranoid country, especially since the Bolshevik Revolution. It has these imperialistic tendencies, but its business model is extractive resources. It's about getting a secure markets for your extractive resources and the highest price for those extractive resources, and trying to keep competitors out and control the routes of supply to get your stuff to market. Now, you could say Putin's really messed up on many of those fronts, hasn't acted particularly strategically, but the mindset is formed from that, which is that wealth is finite, you dig it out of the ground, your population ultimately don't really count, apart from the few professionals you need to dig that stuff out of the ground, to protect your supply routes, and to do whatever processing you need to do. And it breeds a kind of win-lose mentality. There's no concept of win-win. There's no concept of growth, abundance, or being able to generate wealth from cooperation, trust, innovation. That is completely absent from the Russian mindset and the Russian model. People might say, oh, but they have great inventors and innovators. Yes, they do. Almost all of those have to leave and find their way to other countries in order to realize those talents, it has to be said. For Trump, I think this worldview makes sense. It's not the business model of the US. The business model of the US is very much about adding value to raw materials, and not just sort of agriculture, extractive industries. But for Trump, this, I think, is a business model that makes sense. And it lends itself to a much more informal power relations, mafia-style relations. And again, he kind of understands the mechanics of these. So he may not be a Russian agent, but he may be enthralled to that business model. He may think that this is the way the world is going. And either you're part of it or you're not. So you better step up and play the game. In that respect, it could be very scary, because annexing Canada and Greenland are actually quite important if that's the business model you adopt. Because just look at the geography. There's going to be a scrabble for the Arctic, for new trade routes, for cheaper trade routes, to not be dependent on the Middle East, the Panama Canal, which are becoming high cost and high risk. And, Russia, China can place their hands on your windpipe in some of those global trade routes. The ice is melting. These are new opportunities. If you look at it that way, if it's about securing markets for extractive industries, then unfortunately there's some strategic and logical sense behind it. But it does mean the entire world has moved far beyond the post-World War II order into a new era of competition, sometimes hot, sometimes not, between large imperial power blocks. And unfortunately, if you don't act like that, you're not going to be part of that game.
Well, we are definitely not in the post-World War II order anymore, and we're seeing that with everything, right? Post-World War II order was supposed to also be Russia tamed and Russia not being an imperial power, but it obviously isn't. And, no one has been listening to Eastern European countries when all of us collectively and separately have been warning about that. But also at this point, right, the United States is not the same country. It's clearly not in the same line as like NATO and not in the same line as the EU. It's kind of following ambitions of its own, which are similar to Russia, but I don't think they would be friendly with Russia because I think that's just competition, right? Yeah. But that's
and America's in transition, isn't it? I mean, America's also in transition. It's not based on that extractive industry model, even though there are oligarchs who are thinking that way. And you have, really strong vestiges of the previous democratic incarnation of the US. So it's in transition, and it's up for, it hasn't entirely transformed. There is a chance that it may start to row back. And then we've got to think positively in some ways.
Yeah, it's also interesting because, this is happening as like, so many people, like, this is such a big seg, but bear with me. This is happening kind of at a very interesting time because you know how we have had such a hard time kind of landing the ears of people that completely do not understand what's happening between Ukraine and Russia and why it's so important for Ukraine to win and Russia to lose, right? Then we have this interview that Lex Friedman releases with Volodymyr Zelensky where Lex Friedman just sounds so silly and so stupid, but also sounds like so many people that don't understand it, right? And Zelensky spends 3 hours explaining it to him like he's 5 and doing such a good job at it too. And every single person who's watched that interview seemed to have gotten it, whether they liked Zelensky before or not, whether they liked Ukraine before or not. There's so many people expressing how their opinion on the situation changed after listening to Zelensky's interview, right? The only person who seems to have not gotten it is Lex Friedman and a bunch of Russian bots in the comments. But here is where I'm going with this, right? Is we're kind of in the same position with all of these people not understanding what they voted for in the United States or what's happening in Europe, right? How do we get them to metaphorically have this like interview where they sit down and listen and are explained as if they're 5-year-olds as to what is happening and why it's happening? Because it seemed impossible until 3 days ago to land an ear of your average MAGA crazy Trump supporter, right? And explain to him what's happening in Ukraine and why. And then seems like somehow that happened, which is kind of unheard of. So how do we do this here?
We have this problem. We've got this problem in Britain too. We've got a thing called Brexit, which if we were to exist in a world of free trade, low tariffs, and mutually competitive but mutually beneficial relationships between states, Brexit would still be not brilliant and not make an awful lot of sense, but it wouldn't be an absolute disaster. In the world we're heading into, Brexit makes even less sense because we're coming into a world of potentially sort of hostile power blocks where tariffs are going to be imposed, where a mixture of hot, hybrid, grey zone, all sorts of other techniques are going to be used, even between partner nations, let alone these competing power blocks. It no longer makes sense to be an isolated country hoping to craft strategic alliances and trade alliances around the world. You have to be part of a bloc, or you're literally, you're lunch. You're going to be lunch for one of the other power blocks. So Britain has this problem also, I think, getting beyond its own internal issues to look at the bigger picture and think strategically, like, hang on a second, not only do we need to be in Europe, not to be gobbled up and crushed, but actually with the lack of leadership we see in Europe, we would be in rather a good position as one of the leading defense manufacturers, one of the leading militaries, and one of the leading strategic thinkers within the European power bloc. So this is a challenge for all sorts of countries. We've got Germany that is struggling with the far right in the forthcoming election. We've got France also struggling with its nationalistic right, with Le Pen and others. Yeah.
Although I will say that the death of Jean-Marie Le Pen being celebrated with fireworks on the main streets of Paris was kind of so French. It was like very French and a very also, I mean, a death of anyone is not good, but like seeing as like people are so happy for this like super far right anti-Semitic fascist dying is kind of giving me hope a little bit.
It has, but also remember, you wouldn't have seen too many fireworks probably in provincial towns in France, and the basis of his support will come from probably outside of Paris. So yeah, I don't want to put a damper on it, but they still have a lot of power. You see not just the far right, you see the extreme far right leader, whose name escapes me, in France, has just been invited to Trump's inauguration. And then you see all this stuff with Musk, which we mentioned earlier. So, and I don't think it's the case that Trump and others want these guys necessarily to come to power, but they want to destabilize and disrupt and cause chaos, not just in their adversaries, but in their partners. So how this is going to shape up, goodness knows. Because on the one hand, you've got Trump talking about NATO members needing to go up to 5% of GDP. It's insane. I mean, this is going to be one of the most fundamental changes that's gone on really since the post-war period. I mean, prior to the war, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think Britain spent something in the region of about sort of 4-5% GDP on defence. Prior to the Second World War, during the Second World War, that went up to 50%, 45-50%, which is actually very similar to the current rate in Ukraine. I don't know whether the civic society and all the expenditure around that and the hidden costs of volunteers are included, but basically Ukraine's going to be at least 50% GDP. Moving to 5% is just, it's transformational, and no one's talking about the impact that's going to have. On the other hand, his words recently suggest that if he's going to go around actually attempting to annex territories of, say, Canada, whose head of state is the King of Britain, you're going to be at war with Britain. If you annex Greenland, you're going to have to send US troops to defend Greenland under Article 5 against US troops. So this is bonkers, I mean, it means essentially that if this follows through, NATO, Article 5, all of those structures are instantly buried. You no longer need Russia to challenge Article 5, which risks nuclear conflagration. They're done.
Exactly. And especially since we were mentioning Russia, you know how there were countries in CSTO, which is Russia's knockoff NATO, attacking each other, right? Which kind of defeats the point of having this defensive alliance to begin with, because what do you mean you can solve your conflict diplomatically, especially if you're in the same alliance? So this is kind of what the Russian model here would be, the Russian model here in NATO as well, because you don't just say these things to countries that are allied to you. You don't just joke about annexing Canada. You don't just go up to the Prime Minister of Canada and call him a governor. It's just, I know that I think I was actually talking about this to someone else the other day, is I think also weird seg, but bear with me. One of the reasons why why Trump supporters and people that normally don't support Ukraine were so willing to listen to Zelensky is because Zelensky is what Trump wants to be, right? Trump wants to present himself as the man of the people, coming from lower class and making it on his own, but that's really Zelensky. He wants to present himself as a person who just speaks his mind and doesn't care what others think, but that's really Zelensky, because Trump lies his mind and doesn't care whether people notice that he lies or not, or actually he does care because he consistently bans fact-checking, right? And so this is one of those things where this is what they want Trump to be, and so they kind of listen to him. And I find it, I understand that today's politics is such that you can say whatever, it seems, whatever you want, and nothing's going to happen to you. But just for simple kind of like political, correctness and political discourse, this is bonkers. What's happening on the world stage today and what Trump allows himself to say and do is not like cool and edgy and, he's not a politician, he speaks his mind. It's insane. It is absolutely insane. This crosses all the threshold of like, cool and edgy and trying to be himself and not caring for the opinion of others.
Yeah.
This is creating international conflicts out of thin water because these countries have to take this seriously, right? If someone is like threatening to annex your country as a joke 10 times in a week, you have to take this threat seriously. So that immediately puts a wedge between the relationship of the US and Canada. Greenland has to take it seriously. Mexico has to take it seriously. All of these countries have to be on standby. And that's already creating tensions, needless tensions.
And this has got an interesting dimension as well, because let's go with the hypothesis that he's not actually going to follow through with this. So then you have to ask, well, what's this all for? And there's another interesting angle. So I don't know if you follow this guy, Leonid Rogozhin, who's he's one of the Russian colonists. He's a so-called journalist based in the Baltics, ethnic Russian. He even worked for the BBC at some point, and I've been tracking his output for 3 years. Either he's an extreme Russian liberal imperialist, or he's a project. I have a suspicion that he's both. Because immediately, and he's blocked me, of course, by the way, so I can no longer comment on his stuff, like Lex and all the others have blocked me and everybody else in the community. And immediately, both he and, interestingly, Yulia Latinina, who we have mentioned before, who is nominally pro-Ukraine. Although I don't know if you saw the interview with Vitaly Portnikov. I mean, that was extremely revealing. But
they're all pro-Ukrainian until a certain moment.
Until the border. I mean, it was the old saying, isn't it? Russian democracy ends at the Ukrainian border, or Russian liberalism. But they immediately came out and said, aha, look at this. You all said that this whole idea of invading Ukraine because NATO was a threat, you all said that was ludicrous and it was a red herring. This proves we were right all along. I'm like, excuse me, Latinina, right in what sense? You don't want Ukraine to win? What are you talking about? And where's all this rubbish coming from? Where's all this nonsense coming from? Well, originally it comes from the fevered brain of Vladislav Surkov. It comes from Russia. It comes from the KGB playbook. So you're saying all this sort of paranoid nonsense. You guys invented this crap, right? And it's a very convenient, and we're back to the old Russian technique of, you lash out, the victim defends itself, and then you go, oh no, oh look, they hit me, oh no, they're violent after all. I mean, it's a classic sort of victimization bully tactic. It's an obscenity, but you see people across the spectrum, not just regime supporters, jumping on this and going, aha, look at this, the West is evil really, and we were right all along.
I mean, listen, the entirety of Russian propaganda is really just taking things out of context and making them seem like what they want them to seem. It's like, Russians making America sound imperialist. Like, yes, America became America through imperialism, but America has not engaged in acts of expansionism or imperialism in a very long time. Sure. There is there is nuance and context to all of this. Russia takes something out of context and makes it what it needs to make it. It's like today I heard, the newest bit of Russian propaganda, I'm sure you must have encountered it somewhere, but California wildfires are now Ukraine's fault because the American fire department has donated gear to Ukraine. Gear that the fire department would not have used, and also would not, the issue is not in gear. The issue is not in having old trucks. The issue is not in having more of the old uniforms, right? The issue is in the fact that the winds are too strong and they're blowing the fire
embers,
too far. Yeah. And then the other issue is that they're running out of water to subside the fire with. So this would not have changed anything, right? But and also so many other countries donated gear for Ukraine, right? In terms of firefighting and stuff. And also, I will say that according to experts, American fire trucks are actually not suitable for Ukraine because they're meant for very large streets and large cities. And you can really use them in Dnipro and Zaporizhia, but nowhere else. Because everything else in Ukraine is just like not built for such huge machines.
European scale, European.
Yeah, it's like British trucks are actually much better, and so are French and German and stuff. But Dnipro and Kharkiv and and Zaporizhia could use those American trucks. But the point is that this is true. Sure, the U.S. donated all of this stuff, but it doesn't change anything for how the wildfires are being dealt with. However, obviously, if you take it out of context and you say it to an emotional person in the middle of something like, wow, we can't tame these fires, I have family in California, it's going to resonate. And that's how Russia does everything in terms of their propaganda.
It's all based on provocation. And once you've learnt that trick, like, we're going to, you've provoked us, so we have to defend ourselves, when it's nothing of the sort. When a victim defends itself, that's a provocation. And when we've seen this play out over and over again, Russia, if people aren't fully aware of it, were co-initiators of World War II by using this exact same provocation. We're going to go and protect minorities in Poland. Did you ask them if they wanted protected? Did you actually protect them? It's a no, and it's a no again. And it's the same thing with, obviously, Donbass, Crimea, and all the rest. The key thing, I think, is going to be, what is Trump thinking? Because if he's thinking that we're entering a world of hot competition between super power blocks that have, let's say, some imperial behaviors, then clearly he's going to see Russia as an adversary, an equal, but an adversary in that game. And Ukraine may not be on his radar as the most important piece in that puzzle, but it would no doubt be a piece which he wouldn't want Russia to gobble up. Same with Europe. If he's a Russian puppet, he's not going to care one way or the other. But if, as I suspect, he is an admirer of autocracy and he's looking at this new business model, he may be minded to say one thing or get his puppets to go out and say things about Ukraine, which are deeply disturbing. He may do something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Trump doesn't necessarily, I think a good conclusive sort of part of this is that Trump doesn't necessarily know what he's going to do yet, and that's the problem with him, right? Because I think he has ambitions, but he doesn't quite know how to get there, and he's just exploring what works for him best, because at the end of the day, he does what he thinks is best for him, which is why I find it the whole, America first and, like, let's make America great again, such a funny, like, dubious statement, because it's not really about America, it's about him and what benefits him. And I guess we're just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, has he made China great again? No, he's blunted its economic growth, and he's helped to sort of kill off its tech innovation. Has Putin made Russia great again? Well, I think we all know the answer to that.
Yeah, so I think we all have the answer to whether Trump is going to make America great again.
They won't, but they'll make their bank accounts greater than they were before.
Sure. I mean, always, just like when Trump got elected. Well, thank you for having this conversation with me, Jonathan. I wish we could have more of it, and I'm certainly going to see you here again. I do always enjoy talking to you, and thank you for coming over, and I'll see you here next time.
Thank you so much. I'll find another fun location for our next one. I'm next to a river in flood, so yeah, why not?
Well, hey, listen, your car, I've now been with you in your car at distance, with you at a pub at distance. Maybe Thorpe Park next? Can we do Thorpe Park?
Yeah, on a roller coaster, yeah.
Yeah, the whole time. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation and it was as interesting to you as it was to me. If you would like to hear more conversations like it, please don't forget to subscribe to UATV English and, of course, turn on your notifications so you don't miss when the next episode comes out. Also, do give this video a like and share it with a friend because you never know who might be interested as well. And, of course, leave your comments, questions, suggestions, constructive criticism, or just say hi in the comments below. See you next time.